Okay, so hi everyone, and welcome back to Cloud Lunch and Learn. I hope you guys had a great weekend. My name is Dana, and we are on our second session now in our Azure Security series to talk about secure access and identity management. We have Wim with us again, and he'll explain how you can get your Azure workloads 100% secure. And just a note, because we went a bit long last time, if you have any questions that don't fit in within the hour, Wim will be staying behind on the chat. Just if you have any questions at all that you want him to keep answering. So I think I'll hand over to you, Wim.
Okay, thank you, Dana. So welcome everyone to the second session in the Cloud Lunch and Learn Azure Security series. Today we will focus on Azure Secure Access and Identity Management in Azure. After today, there are still two other sessions in the series, which will take place on the last two Fridays of September. Before I start, I would like to thank Dana and Hugo once again and the other members of the Cloud Lunch and Learn team for setting up this great initiative and for inviting me to deliver these sessions around security. For the people who didn't see the previous session, let me first shortly introduce myself. My name is Wim Matthijssen. I live in Belgium, where I work as a cloud architect. Next to that, I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer, so I also deliver all kinds of Azure trainings. Community-wise, I'm a founding board member of a Belgium user group called MC2MC. I also have my own blog, https://wimmatthijssen.com, where I blog a lot about my daily experiences with Azure and all related Microsoft hybrid cloud services. Since July of this year, I'm also awarded as an MVP, what a great honor was and it still is. And like most IT professionals these days, I'm also on Twitter and LinkedIn. So if you ever want to reach out, just want to say hi or ask a question, you can always contact me through my Twitter handle @wimmatthijssen or through LinkedIn. So on the agenda today, first, I will explain why identity is a new security perimeter. After that, I will take a look at Azure Active Directory. Then I will look into what an Azure AD Tenant is and discuss some Azure identities before I will deep dive into IT governance for privileged accounts. Then I will look at some resources and tools that can help to better protect your Azure identities. And at the end of the session, I will go through the key takeaways where we'll focus on the things you should really remember about this session. And totally at the end, like Dana said, we probably still have some time for a Q&A. If it doesn't fit in the hour, I will stay in the chat and you can ask whatever question you want, and I will love to answer it. So let's first take a look at why identity is a new security perimeter. So the first question we can ask ourselves is why securing your identities is that important in your cloud and hybrid cloud environment? Well, these days there are all kinds of Azure threats where attackers may use existing techniques like, for example, social engineering, where an attacker tries to manipulate someone to give up confidential information, or they use ransomware, a kind of malware which encrypts a company's files or data, after which then the attacker demands a ransom to the company to restore access to that data. But there are also some new techniques attackers or hackers like to use, acquiring Azure tenants keys from GitHub, or where an attacker tries to get into an Azure VM by use of brute force or RDP SSH password spray attacks. And when, for example, you're running a web server in Azure IaaS, that server can be breached. An attacker then can use it to install crypto mining malware and use that for cryptocurrency mining, for example. So there are a lot of threats that can harm your identities. So why protecting those cloud identities and why are those protecting those so important? Because these days, a lot of those breaches are still caused by, first of all, credential theft, like I already said, and we still have a lot of user passwords that are duplicates, which still makes it easier for an attacker to track a password down and to get into a system or an application. Next to those, a lot of companies also still have a lot of shadow IT, where employees use non-approved apps for work-related tasks, or they install some apps for private use on their work device, and by that way, an attacker can breach the PC and get into your environment. So the slide shows some example of those identity breaches. For example, you can see the top 20 most popular passwords used by employees, which can be simply looked up by opening just a browser and look for them with Bing or Google. A nice website also listed on the slide is haveibeenpwned.com, where you can check if you have an account that has been compromised in the data breach. You simply need to type in an email address you want to validate, and then the site in the back checks if that specific account is breached. I would say definitely try it out to validate any of your personal or even company accounts and see if they are breached or not. So, and of course, all of those identity breaches can cause the necessary downtime, which not only can impact your business, but also your brand. And as a cloud or Azure admin, it can really impact your career too, because I don't think you really want to be the person responsible of letting your company suffer downtime or loss of any business or data. That's also why foreseeing a proper identity access management implementation as your security perimeter is that important. Then you can protect your Azure environment at the front door, but at the same time simplify access to all your company devices and apps and safeguard everyone's credentials. So let us now take a look at Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory, or as abbreviated Azure AD, is Microsoft cloud-based identity and access management service, which helps you and all your users to sign in and access resources like Microsoft Office 365 or the Azure portal and your Azure resources. If you already have an Office 365 or an Azure subscription, although some people probably won't realize, then you're already using Azure AD in the back. And this because every Microsoft Online Business Service, such as Office 365 or Azure, requires Azure AD for signing in or for single sign-on access. So when you subscribe to any of those services, you automatically will get Azure AD with access to all its free features. Just for clarification, Azure AD is not simply a cloud version of Active Directory domain service, as the name might suggest. And although it performs almost the same functions, it's quite different. When you compare it with AD, here's what Azure AD doesn't do. Let me click. So you can see, for example, that you can't join a server to it. There's no group policy. There's no support for LDAP, NTLM, or Kerberos. It has no organizational units, OUs, or forests. You could kind of see it like a flat directory structure. So these days, Azure AD comes in 4 editions. You have the free Office 365 apps, Premium P1 and Premium P2. The free edition is included with a subscription, like I already said before, from any Microsoft Online service, like Azure, Dynamics 365, or Intune. Office 365 subscriptions also include the free edition, but Office 365 E1, E3, E5, and F1 and F3 subscriptions also include a lot of other features. You also have the premium editions, the Premium P1 and a P2, which Azure and Office 365 subscribers can buy online. So if you want to have all features, you probably, it's mostly for the enterprise customers, you probably will look into the P1s or the P2 license. Following on the previous, in today's hybrid cloud world, most companies have on-premises and Azure or other cloud resources in use. In this hybrid environment, their identities are typically synchronized from the on-premise Active Directory environment using Azure AD Connect. Their hybrid identities then can be authenticated or authorized to all resources if they're on-premises or in the cloud. So what is AD Connect? It's a free Microsoft tool, which can be downloaded for free, like I said, and which will integrate your on-premises directories with Azure Active Directory. It provides the following features. Password hash synchronization to synchronize a hash of a user's on-premises AD password with Azure AD. Pass-through authentication to allow users to use the same password as on-premises and in cloud. And for the people who are still using an ADFS infrastructure on-premise, you can set up federation integration to configure your hybrid environment in combination with ADFS. Next to Azure AD, you also have Azure Active Directory Domain Services, or Azure AD RDS, which provides managed domain services as a PaaS service and foresees simple deployment of a subset of fully compatible traditional ADSF features, such as domain join, group policy, LDAP, and Kerberos NTLM authentication. A nice feature is that it also can be integrated with Azure AD, and then the Azure AD itself can then synchronize with an on-premise Active Directory environment. Just keep in mind that it can only give you a single managed domain per Azure AD directory. And when you create such an Azure AD RDS managed domain, you first will define a unique namespace. This namespace is the domain name, such as adsmydomain.com or any domain you're using in your company. And then in the back, two Windows Server domain controllers, DCs, are deployed into your selected Azure region, for example, the West Europe region, if you're using the Amsterdam data center to deploy your Azure resources. Nice to know is that's because it's a PaaS service, the Azure platform handles the DCs as part of the managed domain. So it will automatically foresee everything from updates to backups. So you're yourself as a customer are not responsible to install Windows updates on those domain controllers, foresee it from Azure Backup or whatever. It's all in that specific PaaS offering. Of course, you need to be able to manage Azure AD. You can use several different portals and apps for this, like the most familiar one, the Azure portal and the Azure Preview portal. But you can also use Azure Active Directory Admin Center. And you can use this portal if you only want to manage Azure AD and no other of your other Azure resources. So if you give, for example, a domain controller admin or an identity admin just the rights to open the Azure Active Directory Admin Center, he can only use that specific AD resources and nothing else. So that's also a way to split up your environment for security reasons. Next to that, you also have the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. If you're using Office 365, for example, and there you can manage your users, groups, and Office licenses. Next to those portals, you can, of course, also use Azure PowerShell, CLI, or ARM templates. A good tip is if you're not that familiar with ARM, you can always check out the Azure Quick Start template site to get you started. Just look for Azure AD and a lot of examples will pop up which you can use in your environment. So let me drink a little bit, sorry. So in the next part, I want to look into the Azure AD Tenant and some important Azure identities. Like I already said, an Azure AD Tenant provides identity and access management capabilities to applications and resources used by your organization. You kind of can see the tenant as an identity security boundary that is under the control of the Azure AD global administrators. Within this security boundary, administration of subscriptions, management groups, and resource groups can be delegated to segment administrative control. Next to that, you can see an identity itself as a directory object that can be authenticated and authorized for access to resources. Those identity objects exist for human identities and non-human identities. Human identities can be any administrator, organizational user, a test user, but also external identities like partners or suppliers when you're using Azure B2B collaboration, for example. The non-human identities include application objects, service principals, managed identities, and even devices. Azure AD is also used to grant objects representing all those identities access to applications and your Azure resources, like there can be Microsoft Exchange Online, Microsoft Teams, and SharePoint Online, but also Azure Sentinel, Intune, and Microsoft developer tools such as Azure DevOps, for example. Next to that, it can also be used to grant access to any SaaS solutions such as Salesforce and ServiceNow, and even on-premise applications integrated with hybrid access capabilities such as Azure AD Application Proxy. So, like I already mentioned in one of the previous slides, the global administrator or global admin is a user account in your Azure environment which you should be careful with or should only be used for specific actions. And this because users with that role have access to all administrative features in Azure AD. As a global admin, you can not only reset passwords for all users, but you can also add and manage domains and regain access to an Azure subscription or manager group when a specific user has lost access. Next to that, global administrators can also set self-service options such as self-service password reset and create Office 365 groups at the tenant level. A thing you should keep in mind is that the person who signed up for any Microsoft Online service, like for example, anyone who signs up for an Azure subscription or an Office 365 subscription, automatically becomes a global admin. So really keep that one in mind. Then you also have a service principal. Service principal is a security identity used by user-created apps, services, and automation tools to access specific resources. You should think of it as a user identity without the user, but rather an identity for an application. Or you can see it as a service account like you used on premises. It only needs to be able to do specific things and you should assign it just enough access to do as little as a specific single Azure resource, for example. As an example, you can create an Azure service principal that has role-based access to an entire subscription, to a specific resource group, or just to a single Azure virtual machine, for example. Azure AD allows a service principal object to authenticate with a username and a password, also known as an application ID and secret, or with a certificate. Best practice, and it's recommended by Microsoft to use a certificate whenever possible. So try to use the certificate whenever you set up a service principal. Next to the service principal, you also have a managed identity for Azure resources. And that's why it's mostly a common challenge when building cloud applications. It's somewhat difficult to manage and keep credentials in your code, which you use to authenticate to a cloud service. Because best is that those credentials never appear on any developer workstation and aren't checked in any source control. Azure Key Vault provides a way to securely store those credentials, but your code still has to authenticate to that Key Vault to retrieve them. And that's when you will use an Azure AD managed identity for Azure resources. Those managed identities are special service principals in Azure AD. And with this identity, you will be able to authenticate to any service that supports Azure AD authentication, including Azure Key Vault and, for example, also Azure Functions. And this without the need to use any credentials in your code. Good to know is that Managed Identity Resources feature is free to use, so you can use it without any additional cost. And Azure resources that support managed identities mostly generate service principals that allow those resources to authenticate it, be granted access to, and be assigned roles to other resources within your complete Azure AD tenant boundary. So this is also an identity you probably, if you're deploying stuff in Azure, are going to use. So it's now time for a first short demo. So let me close the slides. Let me wait a moment. My screen is hanging. Okay, there we are. Here's my Azure portal. I already logged on with my username and password and with my MFA. So if you open Azure Active Directory, for example, you can see that I myself am a global admin. I have a specific license, an Azure AD for Office 365. That's my tenant ID. You can see Azure AD Connect is not connected, so I'm working in a cloud-only environment. If you go into the users, for example, I have a specific user, mine. Good to know is that from over here under the activity, you can look at the signings. So you can see how many times this user is signed in, which request ID, from which location, if it was successful or not. Next to that, you can also look at the audit logs for whatever reason or right someone has done. So you can all check it over here. If you want to focus only on Azure AD, like I said, you can log into the Azure Directory Admin Center, and you can see, I can only see Azure Active Directory, users, and my enterprise applications. From over here, I can also manage all my users, just the same like I did in the Azure portal. Like I already mentioned, you can, if you're not that familiar with ARM and you want to use it in combination with Azure AD, you can go to the Azure Quick Start templates. Just type in the search bar Azure AD, and it will give you a complete list of ARM templates you can use to do whatever identity-related stuff you want to do. There's a whole bunch of them, so if you're not that familiar with them, look at them, test them out, and see if it can work for you. So let me go back to the presentation. Seems I'm locked in my screen. Okay, that's not good. Okay, here I am. I was a little bit locked. Okay, there's my slide again. So identity governance is a subcategory of identity and access management, which provides organizations with better visibility to identities and access privileges, and also better controls to detect and prevent inappropriate access. So in this part, I will focus on identity governance for privilege roles and which steps you can take to get in better control of these accounts. In the previous part, I already talked about the global administrator. Something I didn't mention is that you should only assign the global admin role to users who need to manage features and data across all your Microsoft Online services. So not only for Azure, but also for your Office 365, your Intune, or your Dynamics 365 environment. And you should also limit the use of global admins. Like I said before, those users have privileged roles access to all administrative features in Active Directory, so limit the use of them. By figure of speech, those users have, like they say, the keys of the kingdom and can do whatever they want. Best practice is to minimize the number of global admins to 2, maximum 4 people in your organization. One of the other things you can do to better protect your privileged accounts is enabling multi-factor authentication, or MFA, which you can now enable for free. Using passwords only these days not really meets most companies' high security standards. And with the use of MFA, you will immediately increase your account security, and this by requiring multiple forms of verification to prove a user's identity whenever he signs into any application or portal. Those authentication methods include something you know, something you have, and something you are. So for example, you can use a username with a password and combine that with the Microsoft Authenticator app running on your mobile phone. And whenever you need to verify yourself with the Authenticator app, you can do it with your fingerprint to open it, for example. So then you have a lot of multiple factors for your authentication. But what if MFA malfunctions and you're not able to log in, for example, to the Azure portal, or that you're completely locked out of your Azure AD organization because you can't sign in anymore with your administrative accounts? To solve this, you can create 2 or maximum 3 emergency accounts, emergency access or break glass accounts, like they say. These accounts should be cloud-only accounts that use the onmicrosoft.com domain and should not be federated or synchronized from any on-premises environment. You should also make the global administrator role assignment permanent for them, and you should exclude them from MFA or any conditional access policy you have. It's also best to use the service admin account so you don't associate them with any individual user in your organization. And definitely do not call them emergency or break the glass admin, because if an attacker gets into your Azure AD, it's easy for him or her to guess which ones are your break glass accounts. You should also use a long and complex password for them, at least 16 characters long. But in my opinion, it's better to go for at least 128 randomly generated characters. Store this password in a password manager or print it out, cut it in 2, and save it both pieces in different safes in your company. And only 3 people in your organization should be aware of this password. And a final thing I want to mention about break glass accounts is that you should definitely monitor these accounts with, for example, MCAS or Azure AD Audit, and this especially for sign-ins or logins. So access managers for the Azure resources is also an important identity security aspect you need to take care of. Luckily, with Azure role-based access control, RBAC, free to use Azure authorization system built on Azure Resource Manager, you can control who has access to your Azure resources, what they can do with them, and what areas they have access to. You should always implement the least privileged access model. So just give a user the minimum access they need to fulfill their tasks. Also good to know is that there is a slightly difference between Azure admin roles, like the global admin, which can be used to manage everything in your Azure AD tenant, even the root tenant group, like you can see on the slide, where RBAC roles can only be used for a specific scope, which can be a management group, a subscription, a resource group, or a specific resource. So how does RBAC works? You first define a security principle, which is an object that can represent a user, a group, a service principle, which is used by applications as a resource, like I already said before, or a managed identity. Then secondly, you define a role, the permissions you want to grant. And last but not least, you define the scope, which then can be, like I already said on the previous slide, a management group, a subscription, a resource group, or a specific resource. Some examples of when you use RBAC, for example, to allow one user to manage VMs in a subscription and another user to manage the virtual networks. Another example is to allow a database administrator DBA to manage all Microsoft SQL Server databases in a subscription, or allow a user to manage all resources in a resource group, such as the virtual machines, the websites, and the subnets. Depending on the role, a user has the capability to do more or less things. For example, if he's just a reader, he can just view the resources, but can't do anything else. If he's already a contributor, he can almost do everything except giving another user specific rights. There are several built-in roles that you can assign. Currently, you can use around 70 plus built-in roles like owner, virtual machine contributor, backup reader, and so on. If the built-in roles don't meet your specific needs, you can also create your own custom roles. A tip I want to give is that it's best that you start from a built-in role, you copy it, and start from there to adjusting that specific role to your needs. So it's time for our next demo. Hopefully my portal now works. There it is. That's a lot faster. So if you want to enable MFA, for example, for a specific user, you can open the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. You can go to users, select your active users. You can see I have 4 users running. You can click on the multi-factor authentication. It's opening another tab. And over here, you can see for this user, it's an enforced. So that one already has MFA enabled. If I want to, for example, enable MFA for Jeff Peters over here, just select it, enable it, and in the back, it will do it. If you want to do it for all users at once, you can also choose the bulk update. So let me now go back to my Azure portal. So for example, I have a specific resource group. Let me look for it. I shall choose my demo resource group. In this specific demo resource group, there are a couple of VMs. And I want to give, for example, a specific user virtual contributor rights to for those VMs. I can go to the resource group level, click on access control, IAM control, add a role assignment, click on add, it will open. I can select a specific role. Let me look for virtual machine. I select the virtual machine contributor role, assign access to an Azure AD user. I select my user, Jeff Peters, click on it, just click save, and in the back, it will add that specific role to that user. If I want to check which roles are applied to a specific user, I can go into Azure Active Directory, click on users. I also have that specific user over here, click on Jeff Peters. I can click on Azure Role Assignments. It's select my correct subscription. It's my production subscription. And you can see that specific user has now virtual machine contributor rights on this specific resource group. So that's in a way how RBAC works and how you can adjust it to a specific role and to a specific user and to whatever resource or resource group, subscription or management group you want to apply those roles. Let me go back to the slide deck. So, of course, there are some other resources and tools that you can use to help protect your Azure identities. Managing identity security for your Azure environment can be difficult, like you already saw. Luckily, you can now simply enable Azure AD security defaults, which itself makes it easier to help protect from identity-related attacks with pre-configured security settings recommended by Microsoft. Like there are, for example, requiring all users to register for Azure multi-factor authentication or blocking legacy authentication protocols. Also, protecting privileged activities like access to the Azure portal, for example. The only thing you should be aware of is that if you're already using conditional access and you have a specific conditional access policy already applied in your environment, security defaults won't be available for you, so you can't enable them. Another tool that you can use is Azure AD Identity Protection. This tool, which requires an Azure AD Premium P2 license or an Enterprise Mobility and Security E5 license, is solely focused on risks regarding the compromise of user accounts, including suspicious sign-in attempts. It helps you to protect your users by performing 3 key tasks: automate the detection and remediation of identity-based risks, investigate risks using data in the portal, and export risk detection data to third-party utilities for further analysis. Azure Active Directory Identity Protection includes 3 default policies that administrators can choose to enable, just like you can see on the slide. These policies include limited customizations, but all of the policies allows also for exclusion users such as, for example, your break glass accounts, where I talked about a little bit earlier. Currently, it will help you detect 6 types of risk detections. For example, it can detect users which leaked credentials and signings from anonymous IP addresses, or it also detects signings from infected devices, And all those detections are stored in a record called risk events. If you want to read more about it, I added the link at the bottom of the slide, so you can always take a deeper look at it from over there. Then you can also use Azure AD Privileged Identity Management, or PIM. PIM is an access management service that helps you better protect your privileged identities, like, for example, your global admins. PIM enables you to manage, control, and monitor access to important resources, not only for Azure AD or Azure resources, but also for resources from other Microsoft Online services, such as Office 365 and Intune. It provides you with time-based and approval-based role activation, which will help you to mitigate the risk of unnecessary or misused access permissions. A good tip is to combine multi-factor authentication with RBAC and then integrate it with PIM. So that's a combination of three securities features that you can let all work together. So if we look at the workflow for PIM, first of all, a PIM admin needs to define any user which need to have permanent or eligible access rights. Those, like I already said, those privileges can be time-bound. So for example, you can set them that they are just valid for 2 hours. Then whenever an admin user needs to perform a task, he needs to activate his privileges. And then everything he does in, for example, the Azure portal, is logged with detailed reporting and auditing, so you can really follow up whatever he did. And when his time is passed, his privilege rights are taken away again. So then he needs to ask him again, and you can start the process all over again. Of course, to use PIM, you must also have a valid license. This can be an Azure Premium P2 license, an EMS E5 license, or a Microsoft 365 Education A5 license, or an Enterprise E5 license. The thing you should keep in mind is that when a license, like for example, your Azure AD Premium P2 license expires, PIM features will no longer be available in your directory. Permanent role assignments to Azure AD roles will be unaffected, but the PIM servers will no longer be available to activate, manage, or perform any access reviews in any way. And all your PIM configurations will also be removed. So definitely keep that one in mind. Another tool you can use is Azure AD Conditional Access. Conditional Access is an Azure Active Directory tool that you can use to manage and control access to all your corporate resources, if they're on premises or running in Azure. So at their simplest, conditional access policies are if-then statements. If a user wants to access a resource, then he must complete an action. They give you the possibility to make automated access control decisions based on conditions for accessing any of your cloud apps. Commonly applied policies are, for example, requiring multi-factor authentication for users with administrative roles, blocking signings for users attempting to use legacy authentication protocols, or blocking or granting access from specific locations. So if a user is working from inside the company, he can use specific apps. If he's working from home, some apps won't be available for him because he's at another location. And of course, to use conditional access, you need to have also a valid license. And this can be a Premium P1 license or a Microsoft 365 Business Premium license. But if you want to add the risk-based conditional access policies, you should have an Azure AD Premium P2 license. So it all depends which license you have, which features are available, just like all the other stuff. So let me go back to the portal once again. If you want to enable the Azure AD security defaults, that's quite easy. So we just once again go in Azure AD Active Directory in your Azure portal. You scroll down to Properties. Click on that one. And at the bottom, you can see Manage Security Defaults. You click on that one. And over here, you can enable them. If you have, like I already said, any conditional access policy applied, you won't be able to move the slider from no to yes or back. A nice other thing to look at is the security. So once again, you click on security. Over here, you can configure conditional access. Yeah, for this environment, I don't have the right license. So you can see you at least need an Azure AD Premium. You can also configure identity protection. Once again, the same. You always can apply for a premium trial if you want to test it out. So definitely give it a go. A nice thing I want to let you show you is under Manage, you have Identity Secure Score. If you click on that one, you get your Identity Secure Score, and you get some actions you can, which can help you to improve your score. So you would better apply to all identity-related security, like Microsoft would implement them. So, for example, you can require MFA for all administrative rules, and that specific score will go up with 25. In my idea, it's not to get 100 on 100. If you get it higher and only implement the things you should really, your business needs. So look at it by yourself, implement the things you want to implement, but it's an easy way to see how to uplift your identity security. Let me go back to the slides. Let me open it again and share it. So here we are. So before closing off, I just want to give you some key takeaways. 5 things you should really remember about this session. First of all, know that identity is a new security parameter, and that you should really try to secure all your cloud identities. Secondly, create your break glass accounts. So when MFA malfunctions, you're still able to manage your Azure AD Tenant and Azure resources. Keep your privileged users under control with PIM, so you can limit the time someone can perform privileged tasks. Yeah, if you have the valid license, of course. When assigning RBAC roles, always take use of the least privilege principle to give users only the rights necessary to fulfill their tasks. And last but not least, just like you should foresee a good Azure governance plan, also foresee a good identity governance plan to start managing your identities in a secure way from starting your environments or your cloud move. So that's it for today. I don't know, Dana, are there any questions popped up?
We do. We have one question here. If you enable security defaults, those apply to the subscription. What happens to break glass accounts?
They're also, those MFA is also set for them. So you need to disable it for them. So you need to go into those accounts, and you should really get them out of MFA and any conditional access policy, because some time ago, I think it was a half year ago, there was a big problem with MFA. And one of the things is, if you set MFA for all your break glass accounts, they really don't have a point, because you're not able to log in anymore. So a break glass account, just follow everything I put on the slide. And one of those things is, if you enable those security defaults, MFA will be enabled. Just go to that specific account and disable it again. So that's not MFA should not be attached to that specific user. Otherwise, it has no point to have a break glass account. I hope that answers the question.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
Yeah, the security default is an easy way to implement a subset of Microsoft recommendations. But if you're already using conditional access and MFA and the other stuff, you probably won't enable it. But if you're starting with Azure, or you're starting with setting up your environment, and you're not that familiar with all those specific identity features and services, it's the easiest to just enable it, and then certain things are already enabled in the back automatically. That's the trick. But if you start getting higher in your identity security and getting better and better in it, you probably will disable it and start using the other services.
Perfect. We just have another question here. Is PIM something that is enabled for privileged accounts in a P2 license AD, or something that is requested on demand when trying to access resources?
You need to enable it for specific users, but you need, first of all, you need to have that valid license, like a P2, for example, or the other ones, the files, the Microsoft 365, E3, E5, or whatever license. And then, for example, you have 3 global admins, let us say. You can enable it specifically for that specific global admin. So you need to enable it and go through the process. It's another, you can, through the Azure resources, you can add it. It's also the same like you would manage Azure Service Health and open it from the sidebar, open PIM, look for that specific account, and you can set whatever you want. You can even set for that specific account, his time that he has privileged access is for 1 hour. For that other global admin, it's for 2 hours. It's purely focused on your privileged accounts, like all your administrators and stuff like that. So you need to adjust it for every user separated. So that's how I do it.
Perfect. So I think there isn't any more. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but mostly PIM is something used in the enterprise grade level customers. That's how I see it in practice, because smaller companies most of the time don't have a P1 or a P2, because they're for smaller companies quite expensive, I think. But it's a nice, how higher the license, how more security you can build in.
Perfect. Does anyone have any more questions they want to pop into the chat?
They can also contact me afterwards through Twitter or whatever if they have any other questions.
That was great. So thanks so much, Wim. That was a great session, and thanks for everyone for joining us here. So we've been throwing a few links at you guys as always. So just as a recap, here is a list of all the links that you can click on. If you didn't get a chance, please do register to get your free resources, and just to let us know that you've joined the session, and it really helps our initiatives because Microsoft can see how many people have been joining these security sessions. You can always pop into our GitHub to look at any resources shared by our speakers. And if you want to refer back to any videos, we have our YouTube channel set up. So continuing on our Power Platform series, next Monday, we have our demo of a contract management solution session on Monday. And of course, we have our 3rd session of the security series on how to secure your Azure infrastructure as a service workloads in a nutshell next Friday at the same time. And we just like to show a slide from our sponsor here. It's Microsoft Azure Virtual Full Day Tutorial Series. They're running a summer sale. It's all virtual, so please do sign up for that. And you can click the link that I've popped on in the chat. And finally, we'd really appreciate it if you could provide us some feedback on this session. It's a very short survey. It's the last link on that recap list of links I've just sent out.
So for closing off, I want to thank everyone for their attention. And like I already said, if you have any question afterwards, you can always contact me through my Twitter handle.
That's perfect. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week.
Yep. Bye.